live there? Are you doing a PowerPoint or? Yeah, did Ben, he got it? Okay. Thanks for coming. In Maryland? No, Maryland. In Marriott.
Like local but international. Wow, I wish I knew about it because because I've been connected with the Sierra Club.
She attended a presentation at University. I'm very excited when she will be in town.
Laura Comer, do you know her? Because one of the things that we were talking about is there's not authorized connection between northern religion like vexes me about, but it's really awesome. Totally awesome. Yeah. The Obama administration is just like climate displacement. It's just one of the things that we're going to address. And so I was like, so, yeah, so, you know, I mean, I think that the, we'll see, you know, meeting yesterday.
Is it training?
They were bringing up all of these issues. Right, I know, right, and then we've got people always ask me for, right, climate change. Well, it's just, I don't know. I mean, you know, he had snow in Alaska. Like not even in 5,000 feet. As of when I left Alaska on Wednesday, a week ago Wednesday. Yeah, I mean, it's just like, you know, yeah, you know, I mean, yeah, so awesome. Thanks for coming. Yeah, awesome. Good to see you. Thanks for coming. Awesome. Nice to meet you. Awesome. Good to see you.
Are you going to stay for a little bit?
Oh, yes, sir.
You're gonna start.
Okay.
Good afternoon and welcome. Climate change impacts, disaster mitigation, livelihoods, power dynamics, food security, population, relocation, Alaska, Bangladesh, the Pacific Islands, the Caribbean. No, you're not at the movies. This is what we're going to be covering today in our session, where we're going to be looking at some of the critical components of resilience and what it means in terms of livelihoods with us members of the Global Resilience Academy. So thanks for joining us today. I'm Roger Mark D'Souza, and I direct our programs on sustainability and resilience here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. And in that work that we do here at the center, we believe that resilience is critical to overall environmental well-being and the well-being of communities. And we think it's very important in helping communities and policymakers bridge the gap between humanitarian and development interventions that allow for short-term and longer-term systemic responses. And we're very pleased because our work in that area is supported by USAID's Office of Population and Reproductive Health, which enables us to examine connections and issues around health, environment, livelihoods, population, and security. So I wanted to start by telling you a little bit about the Resilience Academy, which is part of the reason that we are together here as a group. And I hope that you've managed to see some information on the table outside. It looks like this. There's a flyer outside on the table telling you about the Academy. So the Resilience Academy is an initiative that is supported by the United Nations University Institute for Environment and Human Security, the International Center for Climate Change and Development in Bangladesh, and the Munich Ray Foundation out of Germany. And specifically, the Resilience Academy is a 5-year initiative that's bringing together thought leaders and practitioners who are trying to figure out what are some of the best interventions we can be making around resiliency programming in the context of climate change. The Resilience Academy will meet over 5 years. There are 2 cohorts. The first cohort will meet in year 1 and 2, and we are members of this first cohort. The second cohort will meet in year 3 and 4, and in year 5, both cohorts will come together. The outputs and deliverables from the Academy is very focused analysis and practical thinking about what can be done now in the policy realm and in the programmatic realm. And some of the outputs include scientific papers that will be produced and disseminated. The first round of the Resilience Academy focused on the connections between resilience, climate change, and livelihoods. And the second cohort will focus on enhancing resilience to minimize loss and damage. So that is going to be the call for applications to be part of that cohort is now opening. So if you'd like to talk to any of us about what is the experience of being part of this academy, we're about what, 30? About 30 members of the Academy now, so I assume that they're recruiting for about 30 more members, and we're from all over the world, and has really been a very engaging endeavor. So I hope coming out of our discussions today, you'll have a sense of what we have been working on in the Resilience Academy. And I'd like to start with the first member of the Academy who's going to speak today, David Lewis, and you have the bios of the speakers. David is a professor of social policy and development at the London School of Economics and Political Science. He's an anthropologist, has written a few books, Anthropology, Development, and the Postmodern Challenge, and is also well known as a Bangladeshi expert, very well respected within Bangladesh, which I think probably is even more important than being the respect that you may get from folks who are not in Bangladesh, so you have that also. So his book is on Bangladesh, politics, economy, and civil society. And David is going to talk a little bit about how the Academy and the members specifically looked at the connections between resilience, climate change, and livelihood. So you tee up the framing of the work that we've been doing. So David?
Thank you very much, Roger, and thank you for organising what I hope is going to be a very interesting and stimulating panel. And it's a great opportunity because we're all kind of here by chance a little bit, and we thought, well, we can reconvene part of the Resilience Academy in Washington, D.C., which is very exciting. So I'm going to speak very, very briefly about the paper that we have been working on at the Academy, one of the many papers, in fact, but this is the framing paper, which is co-authored by the people here and the people in the academy, and is just about to be published. I think it's published online now in Nature Climate Change. So it's a paper that we're hoping will reach quite a wide audience because we think it's important. And it's based on the discussions that we've been having at these two Resilience Academy events, the first in Bangladesh last year and then the follow-up in Germany earlier this year. And what this paper is about linking the concept of resilience, which has now become a very well-known and useful concept, but linking it more closely with the idea of livelihoods on the one hand and the idea of rights on the other. So the resilience concept has become very popular, but we think that it requires greater attention to be paid to the relationship and the issue of human livelihoods if it's to address the limits to reactive adaptation strategies and also address the development needs of the planet's poorest and most vulnerable people. This is really the theme of the paper. And although the concept of resilience is increasingly informing research and policy, it's been transferred from ecological theory and thinking into social and political systems, which we fear has led to quite a weak engagement with the normative, the political, the social dimensions of climate change adaptation. And that's really what we're trying to get at. So, for example, one problem of the resilience idea is that it's a metaphor which implies a return to a previously existing state or condition before a shock, which, of course, is an important idea, but it also makes it conservative because for people who are the most vulnerable and the poorest, they don't want to build back to that previous state. They want to build back better. And I think that idea of building back better has gained quite a lot of ground now, and it's definitely one that people are engaging with. But we still wanted to go a little bit further than that. And this is where we started to make connections between livelihoods and rights and resilience. So what we argue is that if we bring a livelihoods perspective into resilience ideas and thinking, this will help to place a greater emphasis on human needs and their agency, on empowerment and on human rights. And in putting livelihoods systems in the context of wider transformational changes at the policy level. So many of you probably have come across this concept of livelihoods, and in particular the Sustainable Livelihoods Framework, which has been around as a set of ideas within the development policy world now for a couple of decades nearly. And the Sustainable Livelihoods Framework is this idea that if we're looking at changes to the position of the most vulnerable households, it makes a lot of sense to start with a household perspective and to look at the various types of resources that households are already using to try and improve their position or to maintain their position or to reduce their vulnerability and to strengthen their livelihoods strategies. And what this framework does is it looks at both the tangible and the non-tangible resources that households draw upon in trying to undertake and maintain their livelihoods. And it also provides a way of linking the micro and the macro. It looks at both the small-scale aspects of how households work and how they go about trying to build and maintain and strengthen their livelihoods, but it also looks at the different forces which both act upon them at the institutional level, but which also they seek to engage with or to influence or to change. So it links households and wider institutions, and it links households with wider power dynamics. So in this paper, which is a very short paper, and it's intended to be short because it's trying to be readable and accessible to everybody, and I'm going to be very brief as well. I'm going to stop talking in a minute. But there's a couple of very brief examples that we give in the paper. One of them I think Robin will probably talk about later on this afternoon. But to illustrate what I'm talking about, there's a very small example we give from Bangladesh, from an NGO called ActionAid, which undertakes a kind of community-level research approach to local-level adaptation, which it calls people's research. And it basically works at community level to try and build the capacity of rural communities to both understand the changes that are associated with climate change, how those changes impact on that community, to research the history of those changes through their own oral histories, through their own memories of different kinds of harvests and changes and water access and drought and all of those kinds of things. So it works with people to build, for example, climate change calendars, seasonal change measurement, looking at things like sort of awareness around the climate change issue. And it's leading to all kinds of small-scale innovations, which are very important, things like new cropping patterns, assisting people with different water management techniques, looking at a needs-based strengthening of livelihoods, in other words, rather than the kind of top-down approaches which have characterized a lot of the policy efforts in Bangladesh over the last few decades. One very well-known one about 20 years ago, which involved a lot of international money and attention and didn't really go very far at all, was something called the Flood Action Plan, which did very little to change the problem of flood control in Bangladesh. And I and many other people are very anxious that the new interest in climate change and adaptation and the resources that are going into it, that we don't fall into that same top-down trap again. So this is an example of how, certainly at the level of one NGO and its approach to community-level adaptation work, which of course is also supported by work at the institutional level in terms of advocacy, campaigning both nationally and internationally to try to secure influence in the wider policy processes that also impact down onto this very one, this one particular community location. So I will stop now and hand over to Ashik, who is going to, I think, talk a lot more about Bangladesh in more specific detail. So
Great.
thank you very much.
Thank you, David. So let me ask you a couple of questions before we go on to Ashik. So, we're familiar with livelihoods. You specifically talk about livelihood systems. Could you explain a little bit more about what you mean by a livelihood system?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. When we think about livelihoods, we think about, people's income. We think about maybe if they're rural people, we think about the land that they may own or have access to and the crops that they grow, the material aspects of that. But a livelihood system is much broader than that. It looks at all the tangible and non-tangible resources which would go into maintaining livelihoods. But it also looks at livelihoods as more than just material things. It looks at human development issues, it looks at education, it looks at politics and rights and quality of life and well-being and the spiritual dimensions of a livelihood. I mean, all of these things, much, much broader than the more economistic views of what a livelihood might be.
And when you talk about the household perspective, you specifically talk about tangible and non-tangible resources. Can you give a few examples of these non-tangible resources?
Yes. Well, let's think about, say, land rights or patron-client relationships that make it possible to maintain your livelihoods by getting, say, types of informal loans or particular costs which may be associated with those loans that may not be immediately visible or measurable. So certain obligations, for example.
Great, thank you. I think that's very important because one of the criticisms that we hear of resilience programming is that it doesn't always address these non-tangible elements, and this is an attempt to make sure that this is captured and brought into thinking about resilience. And Ashik Rahman is actually going to talk about this in the context of Bangladesh. She's an environmental and development anthropologist and has been working as a research associate in the Bureau of Applied Research and Anthropology at the School of Anthropology at the University of Arizona since 2010. He's currently a PhD candidate in the School of Anthropology at the University of Arizona. So Ashik, I'm going to hand it over to you to talk about power dynamics in Bangladesh. You can stay there, you can come here, whichever is easier. Yeah.
Okay, thanks Roger for the nice introduction. So David already talked about the livelihood resilience, and it was the introduction of my presentation. So he made my work as half. Just do me a favor, from the audience, how many of you are familiar with the concept of resilience, firstly, and secondly, Bangladesh? You know more or less about Bangladesh. Please raise your hand. Oh, that's good. Okay. So, I'd like to begin from the end, because we have very limited time. David already talked about the resilience livelihood system. When it comes about livelihood resilience, climate change adaptation, you can do a lot of work. You can compile thousands of recommendations for both national and international NGOs, for development practitioners. You can pour tons of money, but you are not going to be success if you ignore just one thing. That's governance. The gist, the summary of my presentation is, do not forget governance. So many of you know about the geographical location and the socioeconomic condition of Bangladesh. It's between India and Myanmar, and of course it's in South Asia. And the size of Bangladesh is a little bit smaller than Florida. Florida is 170,000 square kilometers. Bangladesh is 147,000 square kilometers. And we have 160 million people. So it's like you are putting 160 million people in a state size like Florida. And our GDP is $1,200, but most of the people live on less than $1 a day, because it's a highly stratified society. And we contribute to greenhouse gas emission very limited. It's like 0.1% compared to 22 or 24% of US emission. These are the examples of some extreme weather events. It's a flood, you can see. This one is riverbank erosion. Thousands of people are every year displaced by riverbank erosion. It's a cyclone. There was two devastating cyclones in 2007 and 2009. One called Cedar, another one is Isla. And many people died. Millions of people were displaced. And I think US provided $19 million as assistance and sent a naval ship to help to the, after the disaster. This is the Cedar in 2007, you can see. This one is about Isla. So what do people do to adapt with this kind of extreme climatic events? People do struggle. they do adapt. I called the people of Bangladesh as climate warriors. You can see this is a floating garden. So when flood occurs, people can grow their vegetables and other necessary foods. It's very innovative. Kids are going to school. It's a boat. The school is inside the boat. So kids don't go to school. School goes to them. It's the inside of the school, and it's run by solar energy, so you don't emit any greenhouse gases. This is a hospital. It's, in Bengali, it's called Jibantori, that means lifeboat. So you don't need to go to hospital. Hospital goes to you. It goes to coast by coast and stay for 1 week or 10 days in a certain area. People go to the hospital, they take the healthcare facilities. I did a 6 months field work in Sundarban. Sundarban is the single largest mangrove forest in the world, and it's 10,000 square kilometers, 60% in Bangladesh and 40% in India. More than 3.5 million people depends on Sundarban for their livelihood, directly and indirectly. But in last 3 decades, the forest lost its 415 square kilometers. It came out from a recent NASA study. So I did 6 months field work to know these 3 things. What is the existing form of power structure, and what type of activities are carried out by Mastan structure. Mastan is a Bangladeshi word. I will explain it just in the next slide. And how these Mastanocracy, or the unequal power relationship, impact on people's livelihood resilience. Davis talks about the resilience theory. One of the biggest limitation of resilience theory is resilience work does not pay adequate attention to governance, power, and politics. So my research, it tends to bridge this gap. So this is the main slide of my work. Mastanocracy, I developed this concept. In Bengali, we call Mastan. The syndrome is Mastan can be individual, it can be a gang. They are norm breakers, criminal, that does a lot of criminal activities for maximization of profit making and monopoly control over manpower and resources, and that do the political manipulation. And what is the causes? Why this transformation is taking in Bangladeshi society? The main cause is the lack of rule of law. I would say the rule of law is giving a way to develop this kind of system which is dominated by thugs, or the people who have muscle and money. And manifestation is in different levels. It could be in individual level, household level, community level, even in state level, which I don't feel comfortable to talk on the state level Mastanocracy. Even I don't have enough data to talk on. And the institutional influence is very big. It's huge. Political interest and uneven power exercise, because if you have the money and muscle, it's like might is right. If you have the might, you can whatever you wish, you can do. And disparate forms of corruption. This is the Sundarban. People, more than 3.5 million people depend on this forest for their livelihood. They are farmer, they are woodcutter, they are honey collector, palm leaf collectors, and they do collect paths to get into the forest to make their livelihood. So they pay to the forest officials as government revenue. And my study shows they pay more than 3 times what should they pay. Because most of the people don't have formal education, they cannot read and write. So they don't know what is written in the pass, what is the amount. Let's say it's 80 cents. So the document shows the pass for 1 week to get into the forest is 80 cents, and they pay $3. So this is a form of corruption they pay to the government officials. On top of that, if they want to get into the forest, they need to pay the local mastan or tax, the people with muscle. And that's huge. They pay like more than half of their income to the mastan people to get into the forest. So I asked them many questions. One question was, this kind of system, the mastanocracy or the unequal power system, what is the rule of mastanocracy in your livelihood? Does it increase or decrease your resilience to the adverse effects of climate change or in your livelihood system? I did 108 interviews. They all are household head. And I selected my respondent randomly, but 75% are women because the area is dominated by tiger widows. Tiger widows is, let's say your husband is a forester. He goes into the forest almost every day for making livelihood. So if he kills by a tiger inside the forest, his wife will be known as tiger widows in the society. And they are treated as harbinger of bad luck in the society. So what is the rule of this kind of unequal power relation in livelihood resilience? They pay more than half of their income to the mastan. And mastans are like foot soldiers of political elites. They do serve the purpose of political elites, both ruling and opposition. And the political leaders, they protect the mastan, they provide insurance against the legal action and punishment. So the mastan activities increase, the livelihood resilience decrease. That's people's perception. So again, the conclusion. People says tigers with 2 legs are dangerous than tigers with 4 legs. Tigers with 2 legs means the mastan people, and 4 legs means the Royal Bengal tiger. They consider 2 threats to their livelihood. One is the salinity inundation, which damage their crops. And second one is tiger and the mastan. Because many people, almost every week we hear in news someone is killed by tiger inside the forest. And they need to pay, they are forced to pay to the mastan almost every day if they want to get into the forest. So again, to the conclusion, do not forget about governance. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ashish. So you talk about the tiger widows and they're being perceived of this as an omen of bad luck. And I wonder, as you look at this community and this system that's in place, that's very much a corrupt system, and you talk about the power dynamics, are you picking up a sense of the community that this is just their fate, that there's nothing that they can do about it? Are you picking up from them that there's a sense that there's something they can do against this entrenched system to improve their livelihood resilience? What are your thoughts and findings around that?
Actually, this is two aspects. One is the women who are known as tiger widows. They most of them are illiterate, and they do get married between 13 and 16 years. So by 20 years, they become widow, and they have 3, 4, or 5 children. That means they are the most vulnerable people in that community. But the good thing is, nowadays they are gathering together. There is places where most of the tiger widows live, and by help of NGOs, they establish a school for their kids, because the kids are like scheduled caste. People don't see them as usual with other people because they are the kids of tiger widows. Their mothers are cursed, so they are also part of harbinger, of bad luck. That's one aspect. Another aspect is I did 26 interviews of tiger widows. Every interview 3 to 4 hours long, and they have two perceptions about this kind of environmental change or climate change. The people, those who are a little bit educated, connected with the local NGOs, they think it's environmental change. I mean, the humans are responsible for this kind of change. But those who are illiterate and not connected with the NGO people and development practitioners, they take it as a natural change. Did I respond to your question?
Yeah, great, thank you. So I know when you were talking, Vivek was shaking his head. I probably recognizes a lot of these dynamics in India also. So Vivek Prasad teaches environmental policy making related courses at George Mason University. His core research and operational interest is in rural livelihoods and resilience, and a lot of his work has focused on development policy, including climate change, particularly in developing countries. I know he brings a lot of innovative techniques to his teaching in the classroom. We at the Wilson Center produced a film on population dynamics and environmental issues, and Vivek assigned it as his final exam to his class. The students had to look at the film and write a policy memo on the film. So very innovative teaching and research. So Vivek, let's hear what you have to say about working with farmers.
Thanks, Roger Mark, for your kind and generous introduction. And I'm pretty glad that David and Asik made my job easier, because both talked about a lot of intense, difficult concepts to understand. And I mean, going back to my association with Resilience Academy, when I started, we were talking about all these abstract concepts, resilience, livelihood, non-tangible, tangible, and I was kind of wondering, how I would go back and talk to my people, talk to my wife about these concepts. So I was kind of disturbed internally, and in the meantime, I went to India to conduct a small training with policymakers on GIS. So it was not my intention to go to this project site, but it happened. So it was by chance, by accident, and this coincidence happened around similar time, last year, August, when I was first the Bangladesh trip. Just after Bangladesh trip, I was in this area. So I'm trying to understand the story. I would say this is a positive story, good story, hopeful story, and I'm trying to unpack this story and convey policymakers, development professionals, scholars about the concept of livelihood resilience. So still I'm in the process of unpacking, dismantling this case study, and trying to find roots to the discourse, to the knowledge we are producing in different papers. So taking it to the global level, because this is a case study, but we have to understand what is the implication of this case study to the global context. So just going briefly on some numbers. Globally, we have 2.6 billion people dependent on agriculture. 500 million farmers are small farmers, and they produce significant amount of food, and even in future, they will play very big role in livelihood and food production, food security, and all sorts of related issues. So we cannot ignore these small farmers. They are very, very important in our entire livelihood chain. Agriculture is impacted by pre-existing environmental stress. At the same time, contemporary climate change is adding to the stress. So that is also one factor we have to look at. So I will take you to this story, to the case study. This state is in southern part of India. Now there are two states because of some political reason. They got divided into two parts, Telangana and AP, Andhra Pradesh. One of the fast progressing states in India, but if you look at agriculture sector is stressed because of pre-existing environmental stresses, use of pesticide, fertilizer, cash crop production, all sorts of market pressure were working. And around 95, you might have read sometime in newspapers that around 95 there was a lot of cases of farmer suicide. So what happened? They were trying to produce more, and to produce more, they were trying to put more input, and to get that input, they were borrowing money from non-formal sector, and because production was going down, they couldn't repay. So out of that stress, they were just drinking pesticides. So still that case is there, but in less numbers. So that's one part of the story. Second part of the story is, if you look at water, if you look at soil, if you look at overall ecosystem, that was getting stressed because of overproduction or intensity of production. And on top of that, climate change was acting. So this area is known for drought. So drought was also becoming, and it's still becoming more frequent. So that's the context. So I call it, this state or the people of this state, especially farmers, are exposed to double exposure. You have socioeconomic stress and you have environmental and climate stress. That's going on parallelly. So around 95, small NGOs came up with an idea of microfinance, and they started organizing women around microfinance and related activities. So I'll show you briefly how they have been organized. So in nutshell, I would say they have been organized into small groups, and that small groups federates into district level federations, and that's kind of their overarching governance or support system, and each level has different functions to play. So you can see the lowest level is more into doing, and the top level is more into managing, linking, looking at policy issues and all. And if you look at their framework or the structure they have created, this is the way I looked at, and in simple language, I would call it, it's a kind of operating system in our computer. So once your operating system is robust, strong, and functioning, you can add whatever software you want. So that's the way they are doing. This platform, this institutional platform, is kind of changing with the need, with the demand. For example, recent climate change fund is being pumped in that area. So this institution became active, and they grabbed that funding. If there is some sort of social security program is going on from government side, they'll be active, and they'll go and they'll take advantage of that. So that's the way I look at this. Is a kind of operating system, and it changes, it metamorphoses according to the need and according to the situation. So this is very interesting example of institutional platform created by communities for themselves. Now, going back to the agriculture, they are doing a lot of activities. I picked up a case study of agriculture for this presentation, and I call it CMSA, Community Managed Sustainable Agriculture, and there are 3 building blocks. First one is working in biophysical and biointensive technologies. That is very much rooted into their context, into their ecosystem. The second part is involvement of community, especially gender part, in value chain, processing, marketing, information collection, market research, packaging, all sorts of issues are part of that. And the third part, with this emergence of climate change issues, they're also trying to tap climate change fund. At the same time, they're trying to use newer technologies available for themselves. So I'll just show you visually a few examples of what does it mean. For example, this one, biophysical and biointensive technologies. Very interesting part of this technology is this was readily available. This was not new. They knew it. It was part of their observation. It was part of their, what you call, indigenous knowledge. But because of external market force, they were losing confidence. They were losing insight of these technologies. But when NGOs started working, they went back and they recollected and they repackaged and they upscaled use of those technologies. So that's one aspect of that sustainable agriculture. The second aspect is they are involved in value chain, from production, processing, aggregation. Aggregation is very important because they're very small. So their production is also very small. To attract market or any processing unit, they have to aggregate their product. So they are very good in aggregating their product, and you can see the way they are doing. It has very strong gender component. And the third part, this new discussion, new emergence of technologies are also being tapped into their program. Interestingly, now they have started discussing about how to convert their agriculture into carbon credit so that they can make additional money. So very good for them because they make very less money with in terms of, if you think of relative income, their income is pretty low. What is community managed? So this is example. It's very, very micro scale. It happens in household level. It happens in small hamlet level, in village level. So they manage their planning. They do their planning. They manage their extension also. They don't rely on external agencies to go there and teach them how to do agriculture because they have been doing for a long time. This is an example of the seed bank they have. So it's owned by them, it's processed by them, and it's shared by them. And the third one, the way they are doing their market. The fourth one is market. I just wanted to give you an example of how they are, doing their knowledge exchange. So what they do, they find best farmer in their village and they call it hero, and everyone, and if you say someone hero, he would like to perform maybe without taking money. So they find those farmers doing good practices in their village, in their surrounding, and they make videos. And then they process that video using simple technologies, and they disseminate also in their setting. And it's very interesting. Until today, they have produced 2,800 videos, like 5 minutes to 200. And if you type in YouTube, you'll find they have uploaded also those videos, so you can also access. So it's very interesting. It's offline, online technology, and it's a very simple technology. Going there, using small camera, capturing those good practices or best practices, and then disseminating to their own people. So that's one example. Farmer Field School is another example. So again, they do same thing for longer term training or observation. They select farmers who are doing good job, who is doing good performance in their village, and they make them guru, and he will teach or she will teach other farmers. And they charge money also. So there is a consulting fee also. So if you have to learn agriculture, you go there, they'll organize everything for you, and you have to pay them. So it's a very good model. They are not providing that services free of cost. So that's another example of community managed school. Then with the change of technology or upcoming ICT, the mobile technology, they have server, they have mobile technologies all across their, institution, and they collect production data, they collect climate change related data, they collect, market related data, and they take decision based on that. So you can see how, they are making a kind of hybrid case of indigenous knowledge and modern technologies, and both are very simple in this context. Another example in terms of service sector, because if you look at developing countries context, their service sector is very, very unorganized or poor. For seed you have to travel 10 miles, for medicine you have to travel 2 miles, for water you have to travel 3 miles. So it's a kind of very unorganized service delivery system they have. And the simple technology or simple approach to solve that problem would be, just to one-stop shop, bring everything together. So that's what they have been doing. So you can, this part shows, type of services they need and their spatial spread. And you can see in the next, in the right side, how they have, congregated all those services together. Now, these are some key transformations. Again, going back to David's presentation, he was talking about transformation. So I was trying to understand what transformation is taking place after all these issues. So I looked at, and I'm trying to unpack this knowledge. So what happened? Input-intensive agriculture became knowledge-intensive agriculture. Subsistence and low production became diversified and increased production. Passive participants in market became active, very active in value chain, and there is a strong gender component to that. Limited of role of women in household level, that also changed. Now they are decision maker, in their setting. And if you look at overall HDI, Human Development Index, that is also improving pretty much. So what is our take-home message for policymakers, for development practitioners, climate change professionals, scholars? I looked at, and I feel like these 4 would be very important message for all of us. The first one is find the entry point. It could be ecological, it could be social, it could be finance related, it could be technology related. So you have to figure out what is the right entry point in that kind of situation, and also keep your intervention simple. That's the simple message I came across. The second one, farmers can do experimentation, they can do a very good job, but they need overarching support. So government has to come and play their role. Otherwise, it'll disappear, it'll disintegrate. So we have to provide, good incentive, good structure, good support to whatever they are trying to figure out in this climate change context and socioeconomic stress also. Small holders, I'm referring to small farmers and marginal farmers, they can't attract private sector or government themselves unless they aggregate themselves. So one policy recommendation could be, working on organizing them so that they become strong and powerful and they can raise their voice. And that goes very much with Robin's presentation. She'll be talking about human rights issues and all. So there is a kind of element of human rights issue in that context. And the fourth one is localizing service delivery and promoting social learning, because that was huge. That was happening in their village, across village, and in their surroundings. So that is also one thing we need to look at, how to promote their own learning. So I think this was my last slide.
Great. Thank you very much, Vivek. So it was, I think it's fascinating to think about these transformations and how this fits in to sort of building resilient communities. What are your insights into what was driving these transformations? How did these transformations come about? What were some of the driving forces that may be replicable that folks could be looking at for other sites, other communities?
Yeah, I mean, one thing in my concluding slide, I was trying to mention that, again, going back to this entry point. In this case, entry point was not climate change. It was not ecological services. It was not something, beyond their concept or perception. It was simple. It was profit. So profit was driving this
Interesting.
whole
Yeah.
game. And once it started, that platform got structured, then they started adding other components to it. But profit was the main incentive, and they looked at it was very tangible, and they enjoyed that incentive, and they went for it, and then things started working.
And was it really profit, or was it meeting their needs? Was it a livelihood question, or was it profit?
It was a livelihood question because there are 2-3 things happening. First one is they are able to reduce their input, because in past they were using more fertilizer and pesticide. Now they're using more natural farming techniques. So that's one thing. So they're reducing input cost, and also because of higher production, they're able to feed their family, and surplus is going to market. So that is also adding to their to their income and food security. And the third part that is very, very important and very fascinating for them is once they are part of this group, they're able to attract market, private sectors, even government, because now they're very strong vote bank. So politicians would listen them. And so they're directly and indirectly, they're influencing policy also.
Great.
So that's the driving force, I would say.
Thank you. Well, it was very, very interesting to hear you talk about the role of women and how that was so important in your case, because this is something that Clive Matunga is going to be talking about. Clive is the Family Planning and Environment Technical Advisor at USAID Bureau for Global Health's Office of Population and Reproductive Health, where he serves as technical leader in the elevation and advancement of the linkages between population and environment. I like that, elevation and advancement. That sounds carefully thought out, Clive. So Clive has a deep history and experience linking environment, population, and health, and looking at population dynamics and climate change. So Clive is going to talk a little bit about this work in the context of livelihood resilience.
Thank you, Roger Mark, and thank you to Woodrow Wilson Center for inviting me to talk about the issue that I work every day on. And it's supposed to be linking family planning to livelihood resilience. In this paper that we developed for the academy, it's a joint effort between myself and Roger Mark D'Souza. We are reviewing the science, the policy, and programming that links family planning to livelihood resilience. So let's start with the science. When we started working on this paper, we looked at the pathways that link family planning and broader issues of our population dynamics to environmental degradation. And we realized that there are multiple pathways that do this link. And most of them are mediated by complex and often context-specific factors. You might be surprised to know that there's a lot of literature right now on fertility, environment, and natural resources. And more recently, literature that links these to climate change. For instance, the latest report of the Intergovernmental Panel on IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has some very good chapter. One of the chapters is on health. And there's an entire section on access to reproductive health services and how that is linked to climate change, vulnerability, and adaptation. For instance, there's one specific mention to the need for meeting the unmet need for family planning and reproductive health in areas such as the Sahel region of Africa that most of us know has very high fertility and high vulnerability to climate change. And this is seen as a potential way to reduce human suffering and help people to adapt to climate change. The Sahel, most of you know a country like Niger, where girls are married off at age 15, and by the time they hit their 21st birthday, they have 6 or more children. So really, if you're looking at long-term resilience building, issues to do with getting girls to school and providing them with the means to control their fertility has to be part of the efforts to build their resilience. But we also look at the policies. We want to make sure that the evidence that is coming up to support the links also fits into policies. And we look at a number of national development blueprints that have been developed by a number of developing countries. And we recognize that there's clear link. Most of these blueprints recognize the role of rapid population growth, the role of family planning and reproductive health as it relates to broader issues of economic growth and development, but also efforts to build national capacity to deal with disasters. For instance, we look at some of the documents called the National Adaptation Programs of Actions, which were a requirement by the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change to identify some of the urgent and immediate adaptation action. So 49 countries, the least developed countries, developed their NAPAs, and we were pleasantly surprised to see that a majority of them make the links between population growth and climate change. More than 6 of these countries link climate change vulnerability to family planning and reproductive health. Some of them, a couple of these plans propose projects that deal with family planning and reproductive health as part of their national priority adaptation actions. We also review some of the national climate resilience development strategies that have been developed more recently. For instance, countries like Ethiopia have come up with a climate resilience green economy strategy. So we want to see how these national plans look at the issue of family planning, reproductive health, and broader issues of population dynamics. But we're also interested in, because national plans are very critical, but I mean the development partner policies, which support a great deal of the resilient programming in country, are also important as well. So we look at some of the multilateral and bilateral partner policies and guidelines. And specifically, we look at USAID, some of the climate change strategies, and some of the resilience guidance. And I'll be talking more of that in a minute. So this is the USAID Climate Change and Development Strategy, which has a very noble goal to help countries accelerate their transition to climate resilient, low emission, sustainable economic development. So one of the overarching principles, which I'll talk towards the end, is really the need to do integration, because some of these activities happening in the country level are development activities, but you really need to see how best you can leverage the development programming to integrate climate change throughout USAID programming. So, and I mean, this cuts across all the areas, including health, economic growth, food security, and all other priority development sectors. Then there are also efforts at AID to really bring resilience out of the realization of the constant shocks and stresses that have happened, especially in the Sahel, the recurrent crisis in the Sahel, the Horn of Africa, and some of the crises that Vivek mentioned in South and Southeast Asia. So really, it's great to look at a document like this and see that there's a deliberate link to link family planning as an important component to build strategy. I mean, to build resilience to the communities. There are all the great efforts that are being promoted by such strategies, issues to do with agriculture, water resources, economic growth and development, but kind of realizing the need to meet the unmet need for family planning in part of these resilience efforts. There's also a new partnership, the Global Resilience Partnership, which is co-convened by USAID, Rockefeller Foundation, and CEDA Sweden. This is a noble initiative that aims to help millions of people in very in areas like the Sahel, the Horn of Africa, and South and Southeast Asia to build strong and more resilient futures. The partnership promises to accelerate technologies and identify new opportunities that can build the resilience of communities, countries, and regions, and save lives and livelihoods. And there's a global one of the important work plan items of the partnership is a global resilience challenge that went out several months ago, and I hope a number of you were able to see the challenge and hopefully make submissions. This is calling for multi-sectoral collaboration for bold and innovative solutions that can be applied in these three zones, the Sahel, the Horn of Africa, and South and Southeast Asia. And it's great that some of the stories that we are hearing from the academy are cutting across these three zones. So the biggest question is really whether family planning and reproductive health can be one of the items that can be a part of the new, bold, and transformative opportunities to build resilience. So we also look at the programs, and this is where the rubber meets the road, because you have the evidence, which is great and encouraging. We have very good policies at the national level in most countries, and also in some decentralized levels, but good development partner guidelines. But now this has to get to the point where you do the programming on the ground, and this is really because of integration. We have various opportunities that we can learn from, and one of these is an approach that AID has been supporting for the last 2 decades, which is integrated population health and environment. These are seen as community-based activities that were initially introduced in areas of high biodiversity, and getting a congressional directive to really look at the issue more keenly to address population pressures in these areas, and getting integrated interventions in the form of maternal and child health, family planning and reproductive health, broader issues to do with livelihoods, water sanitation, and hygiene. So we looked at some of the various PHE projects, as we popularly call them, that have been implemented all over the world in the last few years, to see how they talk about livelihood and livelihood strategies. And it was encouraging to see how, most of these PHE projects are really central, and they put livelihood on top. For instance, these are some excerpts from project documents from a number of the PHE projects cutting across several continents. So in the paper, we are hoping to show that there are examples out there that can really link the evidence at the global, national, and local level to some of the policies at those levels, but also have some practical application in a community setting, and hopefully scale it up into national programs. So basically, that's my presentation, and we are hoping to get the paper published. Maybe as David's paper goes to the Nature, this will be one of the papers that accompanies it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Clive. So as you talk about these bold, new, and transformative approaches to building resilience, what's your sense of how these issues around population dynamics and family planning and women's empowerment are currently being considered in the meeting, the COP meeting that's going on in Peru now? Do you see that being discussed at all? If so, among whom? If not, do you see it being discussed as we think towards the meeting in Paris, the COP meeting in Paris next year? How is this playing out in the international discourse and in the negotiations? Any thoughts?
Sure. I probably would want to maybe sketch it a little bit in the COP15, when the world met in Copenhagen to talk about to come up hopefully then with a binding agreement. I remember we went there talking about population and climate change, and the biggest question then was, what does population got to do with climate change? And over the years, the narrative has changed, and right now within the global climate change community, issues to do with population and climate change come out quite often, and it can be seen over time how this discussion has broadened to be part of the interventions in the plenary sessions of the COPs, as well as some of the side events and sessions. Right now in COP20 in Lima, Peru, there are a number of groups that are out there trying to make these links, and I mean, a number of country negotiators are more comfortable and coming up talking about the issues. So I feel like the issue has really advanced in the global climate change policy, and hopefully it will be part of the agenda come next year when the world meets in Paris to come up with hopefully another climate agreement.
Great. Thank you very much, Clive. I think one of the aspects of population dynamics that we hear a little bit more about is climate migrants, climate refugees. And Robin Brennan, who lives in Alaska, is a human rights attorney and has been researching climigration. Climigration is a climate-induced relocation of Alaskan Native communities, and she's been looking at this since 2007. She's a senior research scientist at the University of Alaska Fairbanks and co-founded and works as the executive director of the Alaska Institute for Justice, a non-governmental organization that is the only immigration legal service provider in Alaska. So Robin is going to tell us a little bit of about her work in communities in Alaska.
Thank you so much, Roger Mark, and it's such an honor to be with my colleagues from Bangladesh and Germany, and because I'm just so appreciative of all the work that you're doing. And working as a human rights attorney, human rights and climate change are completely interlinked. And this COP, what I've been told, is really focusing on that issue. And I'm taking a Sheikh's term about climate warriors, and you've heard about the climate warriors in Bangladesh and India, and there are climate warriors in Alaska, and these are the people who are being affected now by climate change, and with very limited resources, taking extraordinary steps to adapt and protect their livelihoods and the way that they're living. So I'm really passionate about this issue because climate change is happening in Alaska faster than anywhere else on the planet, in the Arctic. And just to give you an example, so Alaska, people would think snow. By December, we had no snow in Alaska. When I left last Wednesday, no snow in Anchorage, Alaska. Even in mountains as high as 5,000 feet, I flew into the interior of Alaska in the beginning of November, and there was no snow. So the fact that climate change is happening and accelerating is really a critical issue for all of us to be thinking about. Also, I'm sure you're aware of all the snow that got dumped on Buffalo. Well, the reason that happened, if you don't know, is because there was a super typhoon in the Pacific where there were sustained winds of 185 miles per hour for more than 24 hours, and that went up the Bering Sea on the west coast of Alaska and brought all this warm air, so we've been above freezing in addition to having no snow, and then the jet stream is wobbling now, right? And they think it's because of decreased Arctic sea ice. So we have already, I get concerned because at the COP negotiations, it's all about keeping our temperature increases to below 2 degrees Celsius. But in Alaska, we're already at 3.5 degrees Celsius increase since 1975, and there's been a lot of research, of course, being done now. So in Barrow, Alaska, which is in the northernmost part of our state, in the month of October, there has been a 13-degree Fahrenheit increase since the 1970s. So that's from the 1970s to 2009. And of course, these temperature increases are having profound impacts on the environment. So decreased Arctic sea ice, thawing permafrost, which is leading to these accelerated rates of erosion, and repeated extreme weather events. So we don't get hurricanes in Alaska, but we do get hurricane strength winds like this super typhoon that came up through the Bering Sea just a couple of weeks ago. I always talk about Arctic sea ice because for climate deniers, there's no denying what's happening with Arctic sea ice. And there was the first time that a documented record low occurred was in 2007. And that's when I decided to go back to graduate school and get my PhD and went to my first climate conference. And at that climate conference, climate scientists were saying that there would be no Arctic sea ice at the earliest during the summertime by 2100, and maybe as an outlier 2050. Then we get this documented low in 2012, which was 3 weeks earlier than the normally documented record low. And I was with an Inupiaq whaler in January who said there could be no Arctic sea ice in the summertime within the next 10 years. Right? And so just in the span of 7 years, the changes that are happening and why this urgency about adaptation and resilience is so critical, and really what that means in regard to how we're going to make sure that people's human rights are protected. So the focus of my talk is on population displacement, which is, based on my research, one of the most profound consequences that will be caused by climate change. It will happen all over the world, and we unfortunately are completely unprepared based on what's been happening in Alaska for the fact that millions of people are not going to be able to not only live where they currently live, but their livelihoods are obviously going to be affected, whether they're subsistence whalers or working at a local store down the street that no longer exists. So there has been a huge amount of research that's been done, or government studies on the climate relocations that are happening in Alaska. And the U.S. Government Accountability Office is one of the federal government agencies that's been doing research or studying this issue. And in 2003, they did work in Alaska, and they found that there were 3 communities that were seeking to relocate, and 184 other indigenous communities were being affected by flooding and erosion. And there are 229 indigenous federal tribes in Alaska, so 184 of them, that was about 86% of the indigenous villages in Alaska, were being affected by erosion and flooding. Those 3 communities, Kivalina, Shishmaref, and Newtok, some of you have maybe heard about them. They've been in the news a lot. They are climate warriors. They have been trying to educate everyone. They've met with Congress, they've met with the White House, and talked about the urgency of their situation because they have chosen to relocate. They have made the decision. They can't stay where they are. They need to move to a different place. But protecting their livelihoods has been essential and has made this discussion of relocation truly, truly difficult. So 6 years later, the federal government went back and went, wow, these 3 communities, they haven't been relocated. What's going on? And the problem is there are no government in the United States, no federal, state government agencies that have any mandate to relocate populations. There's no funding available specifically for relocation. So those are significant, but the really big piece was just in the span of 6 years, a number of communities that were thinking about relocating quadrupled. And unfortunately, still no community has yet relocated. So these are the 12, this is a map of the state of Alaska, and these are photographs of some of those 12 communities that have been thinking about relocation. All of these communities, as I mentioned, are indigenous tribes. None of them are connected by roads. Subsistence is I can't overemphasize how important subsistence is to their culture and community, which means that they rely on the resources in their vicinity. And so for Kivalina, which you can see is on the northern coast, and Shishmaref just a little bit south, they are on barrier islands. And with Kivalina and Shishmaref, They have chosen relocation sites to maintain their livelihoods, which is subsistence. And the federal government has come back because there have been no guidelines of how you choose a relocation site, to whom do you go to figure out if your relocation site is appropriate. And the federal government has come back multiple times and said these relocation sites will not work because this permafrost is going to thaw. And so both of these communities are in a stalemate, meaning they're not going anywhere. They're in an extraordinarily dangerous situation. So when that super typhoon was going up the Bering Sea coast, all I could think about was praying that nobody would die, because there is no evacuation route. These are barrier islands, no roads, no public transportation. You know, they get in and out of these communities in small 10-seater planes. And each of these communities have several hundred people. In Kivalina, they've been using erosion control methods to try to protect people in place. So in Kivalina, in 2006, I believe, the federal government spent millions of dollars to build a seawall to protect the community in place. Our congressional delegation, one of our US senators, flew in with other federal representatives to celebrate the completion of the seawall. The day of the celebration, a huge storm came in. 180 feet of that seawall was destroyed. And a year later, 2/3 of the community had to be evacuated because of an extreme weather event. They have now rebuilt the seawall, but they are still in danger. The community that I have worked most closely with is called Newtalk, and it's also on the coast and it's further south. And they, unlike Shishmaref and Kivalina, they chose a relocation site that everybody agreed was a good place for them to relocate. So my research has really been following them as they have done everything possible to get themselves to that relocation site. And with every step, so the place where they chose to relocate, no infrastructure there. So they have to build everything in order to be actually able to relocate. And every step that they have taken has been met with, the government is trying, but there are these institutional barriers because there's no population at their relocation site. So, for instance, to build a school in Alaska, you need a minimum of 10 children who are ready to be enrolled in school at your location, but nobody's going to move their family to the relocation site if there's no school. And that is just one of like a very small example of the barriers that exist to relocate these communities. So in looking at all of these issues, I tried to figure out, okay, so what can be done? And I've come up with this, what I call an adaptive governance framework based in human rights. And the reason why human rights is critical in this context is because for the government-mandated relocations that have happened because of development projects like the building of dams, or for geopolitical reasons like in Alaska during World War II, the Aleuts on the Aleutian Islands were forcibly relocated to theoretically protect them. And it has led to the most disastrous consequences for the people relocated. They've been further impoverished, it's broken their social and kinship networks. And so basing these relocations in human rights is essential. And so we always start with protection in place, right? I mean, that is for any person who is living in a place that they love, relocation is your last thought about how you're going to adapt to climate change. But the reality is sea level is rising, and we don't know how fast, and we don't know when it's going to really inundate places. And so the way that I've conceived it is, and this is all community-based, so communities working with their local governments, and I know that that's the ideal, right, depending on the transparency of the government that is working with the local community, work out these, what I call them, social ecological signals to figure out when protection in place is not possible, so a relocation process could start. And so you look at repetitive loss of structure and extreme weather events and what's happening with saline intrusion in your potable water source, and are your livelihoods being affected, and how is your public health being affected by all these climate change impacts. And then you work towards relocation and getting to safety. In regard to human rights, and one of the aspects of this that makes it unique is that in the context of human rights, we normally think of human rights as being individually based. So I have human rights and you have human rights, but we don't normally think of collective human rights and the collective rights of communities to be together. And that's one of the pieces that really needs to be further worked out and articulated, because for lots of people, and it's not just Indigenous communities, but obviously for Indigenous communities it may be more intense, is people want to stay together with their family and social networks. And how are we going to make sure that the human rights of everyone is protected when they can no longer stay where they are? Thank you.
So Robin, your passion always comes through,
I know.
which is fantastic, and really good to have a sense of just sort of the practical dimension of this and how difficult it is. So you talk a lot about human rights and the lack of a mandate for action. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the legal status. So are these communities able to claim anything as climate refugees? For example, is there any legal standing for benefits that they could accumulate in international law or any other regimes?
Well, that's a great question. And so, so the term climate refugees is seriously problematic, which is why I came up with the term climate migration. And the reason why climate refugees is so problematic is one, in the UN Refugee Convention, climate change or environment it's not one of the defining aspects of being a refugee. So it's for political opinion, membership in a social group, national origin. But more fundamentally, the concept of a refugee is that you cannot rely on your country of origin to protect you. The whole concept of a refugee is your country of origin may be the actual persecutor or unwilling to protect you. And in this context of climate change, and I use the Maldives as an example, they are doing everything possible, the Marshall Islands, Tuvalu, to protect their citizens. And so in the context, I mean, when we're thinking about climate change and the impact on people, we need to think that our countries are going to want to protect us, and what the challenge is whether or not they have the capacity.
Thank you. Well, I'm glad that you mentioned islands, because I'd like to very briefly talk about islands and then open it up for discussion. So the paper that is coming out of the Academy is something that I am working on as someone from the Caribbean with partners who are based in Hawaii, in Australia, who's been working on the Pacific Islands, and a colleague who is from Sri Lanka. And really we're looking at how islands are portrayed in this international debate. So this entire country is about to be wiped out by climate change. It won't be the last. And specifically, we wanted to talk about what is happening in an island context. There's this dominant portrayal as vulnerable victims in an island context. Has it become so entrenched that it has constrained efforts for resilience and resiliency in an island context? And how does this fit into discussions and policy prescriptions about limits, boundaries, and transition? So we looked at a series of case studies from small specific islands, Philippines, Sri Lanka, Hawaii, Madagascar, and the Caribbean, to come up with some conclusions about what's happening in the context of islands and how islanders are actually island climate warriors themselves. So Ashik, you're infusing your words throughout the panel today. But what we did is we looked at a case study in Fiji to look specifically at how communities in Fiji are preparing for these shocks to their system. And we saw that there were a number of examples of island coping strategies that have been tested over time. So things like communities relocating their houses further inland, building stone seawalls, using certain vegetation that provides more of a buffer. In terms of cyclone preparation, that they would think of looking at mature crops or fruits from trees and collecting them before the cyclone hits, or following an event, they very much are focused on planting crops that mature quickly, such as corn and certain varieties of cassava. So these are island livelihood strategies that have made these communities have made them resilient over time, and is really based on traditional knowledge. And so there's a global movement to recognize that local indigenous knowledge can and should be utilized to facilitate disaster risk reduction responses. And we make the case that this is particularly salient in the context of islands. The second point that we touch upon is looking at migration, remittances, and relocation, a theme that we've just touched upon. And we specifically look at Caribbean islanders' maximization of migration as an extraterritorial livelihood strategy that is well established, well entrenched. There's a complex pattern of short and long-term migratory movements that is a livelihood strategy. And we specifically look at a case of a Haitian migrant plantation in Dominican Republic, where this community was facing a number of challenges, but they identified as their top challenge and their top ability to adapt to a changing environment was questions around migration. And this, of course, is tied to remittances, and we argue that in the case of islands, remittances promote the development of human capital and growth of social and cultural capital stocks in local communities that tie sending and receiving states. And we argue that the amount of remittances is particularly important in an island setting, and is based on this maximizing livelihood strategies, and is part of recognizing a coping strategy for islanders where migration is not necessarily a permanent departure from the island, but a strategy to build resilience and in many cases prepare for an eventual return. And then we talk about relocation and build on some of the points that Robin specifically mentioned. We look at a case of Sri Lanka where there was a post-resettlement, forced resettlement policies that were put in place that increased the vulnerability of these populations, and saw that in many cases this was not working. People were being forced to live far from their previous communities. They were forced to live in unplanned settlement areas. There was no good housing that was of good quality. There was no employment opportunities. It created and generated a lot of conflict between the host and relocated communities, and there was a lack of access to basic common resources. So we argue we have some examples of where migration and remittances and relocation works in an island setting, but we also have examples of failure, and this is particularly important in an island context. So we want to learn from what has worked, but also what has not worked, and we want to recognize that looking at resilience in an island setting helps reduce vulnerability by linking migration, remittances, and relocation as a livelihood strategy. The third point that we really drive home in this paper is the importance of looking at women's resilience and women islanders as resilience warriors. And we specifically talk about some of the issues that Clive addressed with regards to human rights, reproductive health, and family planning, and how this helps increase women's ability to plan for emergencies, create safety nets, and evacuate and migrate more safely and easily, how it helps improve health outcomes, which increases their resilience, and how it helps improve their climate change adaptability when it comes to questions around efficacy and having control over decisions that affect a woman's family and socioeconomic and psychological spheres of action. So we examine this by looking at examples from the Philippines and Madagascar and demonstrating how by building women's resilience, you build community resilience, which enhances opportunities for livelihood resilience. So this is an important conclusion coming out of this paper. And then finally, we look at food security systems in an island setting. And we look at examples from Sri Lanka and the Philippines, where in Sri Lanka, we examine the cases of paddy farmers and their adaptation strategies and what this meant in terms of increasing food security and what are some of the examples we saw out of that. And also looking at examples in the Philippines, where there was a linking of population dynamics and food security in coastal areas, which resulted in new municipal governance structures that were particularly interesting and salient in an island setting, and particularly in the Philippines because of the decentralized governance structure that enabled the emergence of these new examples of building resilience. So finally, how we tried to pull this all together was to make a statement that socioculturally institutionalized and place-based practices can be strong examples of building livelihood resilience, that this is particularly important in an island setting, and that there are implications for policies, programs, and research to build on this, that island communities are not just vulnerable, they're not just victims, there's a lot of action that's happening within these communities that the international community should be cognizant of and recognize and bring some valor to. So that's the paper. One of the papers I was working on. So you have a sense of what this Resilience Academy has been touching on. Let's open it up to you for your thoughts, comments, questions. Please give your name and your affiliation. My colleagues will come around with a microphone. So let's start with you, please. And we'll take multiple questions and comments at the same time.
Paul Lundberg. I have a comment or a question for David and a comment for Robin. David, I was with the UN for a long time, and for a long time everything was sustainable development. Was there ever an intellectual deliberation that people went through that marks a shift from the focus on sustainability to a focus now on resilience? For Robin, both the IOM and UNHCR distinguish between refugees and internally displaced people. Internally displaced people have to be supported by their own government. In addition to that, federal government provides substantial subsidies for expensive houses built in terribly environmentally dangerous areas that get destroyed and then get rebuilt again. Are there no programs like this that are available for African natives?
Okay, thank you. Yes, please.
Yes, thank you. My name is Mindy Reiser. I'm a sociologist. I've worked in a part of the world that's not represented here, Central Asia and the Caucasus. But I had a question about what Mr. Prasad said. I want to know what the equivalent of an extension service in India is doing. How active is it? What kind of innovative work does it do? I'm talking about, in this country, we have had extension agents all across the United States whose role is to work with farmers and agricultural people in all kinds of ways. And I'm also interested in exactly who were the catalysts of this creative work that emerged from the grassroots. You talked about profit, and then this was expanded a little more. But who were the people who got it going, and how did people buy into it? I think that's a useful lesson, potentially.
Great, thank you. Yes, front.
Hi, Mary Vandenbroek with USAID. I want to congratulate all the speakers. These were fantastic presentations and very thought-provoking. I have a couple of questions. First for Dr. Prasad. Very interesting, the community-controlled and empowered type of agriculture that you're doing. I wondered, you did mention the profit idea, and I wondered how those profits are being either reinvested into the community or if they have resulted in the people eating more of the diversified diet that they now have and improved nutritional outcomes for women and children under 5. My second question is for Robin, and I wondered what kind of lobbying is going on with your state folks and the federal folks to try to get some policy and regulatory changes made, because this sounds like it's reaching an absolute critical point.
Great, thank you. Yes, please. Other questions? No? Good for now? Yes? Okay. All right. So, David, would you like to start?
Yeah,
Sustainability to resilience, intellectual deliberations.
Thank you. No, thanks, Paul. That was a great question, and I would say that it would be wrong to think of resilience as somehow a shift that replaces the concept of sustainability. I would argue that resilience brings another dimension to the concept of sustainability, and I think it's one that, if we trace back the concept of sustainability and development to the Brundtland Report in 1987, I think it's probably one that the people who put that together would recognize and would be happy to incorporate within any definitions of sustainability.
And sort of, how do you define sustainability versus resilience? It's like, I knew you were going to ask me that, Roger Mark. I kind of sidestepped that.
No, I mean, I think sustainability I would define in terms of trying to safeguard the resources for future generations that allow livelihoods to be made and the wider environment to be protected and conserved and and replenished, and I think this idea of resilience as being building back better, it implies that environmental and sustainability dimension is built into resilience, so that we don't simply go back to unsustainable practices after shocks. So I think it fits very, very neatly into the sustainability perspective. I mean, other colleagues may want to offer more sophisticated definitions than that, but
So Vivek, you have a number of questions. Extension service in India, who are the catalysts for this creative work? How are the profits reinvested? And are you seeing any results in terms of diversified diet and nutrition?
Okay, all are interesting questions. And I have written a discussion paper on this topic, and it will be published I think by the end of this month. It will be published by Eco-Agriculture Services. I'll forward you the whole link so that you can start disseminating. So going back to the questions, all are very challenging questions, to be very honest. The first question, farmer, the whole extension services. So, I mean, yes, Indian economy is primarily agriculture. It used to be. Now it's kind of reducing because service sector and manufacturer sector is becoming bigger. But still agriculture is very important. There are a number of universities, even we have Ministry of Agriculture, different departments, they work around these issues. So there is a well-established extension network. But the issue is that extension network is not, I won't say not, but it's not very effective because of geographical location, smaller communities, they live in smaller pockets. So it's very difficult sometimes to reach to them. And also this extension services are designed around green revolution. And that green revolution is about input intensive. going for big scale, going for higher production. So these are some philosophical underpinning to this extension services. But we are talking about small farmers with small land, with small input, and their whole life, their whole livelihood is about that small agriculture. So we need very different type of extension for them, not like regular stereotype customized extension. So that was one problem, and that was not working for these farmers. So that's one part of the story. Second part of the story is who is driving this whole program. Initially, it started with small farmers. I have a documentary, and it talks about. I got a documentary way back in 1995. They created this knowledge input agriculture in one village, and once they got success, it started becoming kind of movement. And so initially it was NGOs they started, then they aggregated themselves. They created consortium of NGOs, and once government realized that this is becoming a powerful political force, they got into. So government themselves, state government got involved. They started, putting their funding, their public expenditure, and also they created some sort of hybrid agency to look at this issue. And that in that hybrid agency, they had representative from government side and also representative from people side. And also, in terms of who is driving this program, from project management side, it's young professionals. Many young professionals from very good universities are not joining corporates or profit-making agencies. Rather, they're going and spending their 2 years' time just to see that rural setting and explore themselves. So that is also one thing that is happening. I was talking about that example of ICT, information communication technology. These young youths are basically creating those apps for farmers without taking money, because they just want to experiment with themselves, their own knowledge. So that is what is also happening. So this whole concept of social capital is working very strongly. And when I say social capital, it's not only farmers, it's a kind of ecosystem that has students, that has bureaucrats, that has politicians, farmers, even many university professors, they feel like they're getting bored in their university setting, so they go and they spend time. People like me, I was there to train them how to use GIS, but I got hooked, So that there is a kind of momentum going on, and that momentum is driving this whole program. So that's the question answer on who is driving, and you are also raising this question, who is driving? So now they're a political force.
Great. Profits?
Yes, profit. When I say profit, I'm thinking about doing a livelihood maths. So it's a complex concept. And when I say profit, I look at four components. First is, what is being reduced in terms of input? So fertilizer is getting reduced, pesticide is getting reduced, and that is being replaced by natural elements. So that's one thing. So reduction in input. Then the second part is production. I'm looking at production and productivity also. How this input reduction is, or natural process is converting into profitability or production. So that's second part I'm looking at. Third part, the production is more or less, still we have to work on certification, but it's organic. So it's feeding to their family, it's feeding to their community, and it's also providing a base for organic market. So they're processing, they're packaging, they're aggregating, and they're making or they're trying to harness market incentive also. So that is also coming into this math. So I'm looking at 3-4 things together: reduction in input, production, then market incentive, and also with this organization, the institutional platform, they are able to, I'll use your word, they're opportunists now. So if something happens in government sector, for example, if there is social safety network program, or there is some sort of empowerment program, or some sort of extension program, they're ready to catch that opportunity. So that is also adding to their income. So that's the way I'm defining profit. It's not simple math. It's a very complex in terms of livelihood concept. Now, coming back to the last question, nutrition, I have one number to explain what is happening in nutrition. I looked at data before project and after project. Child weight at the birth was 2.3 kg. Now it's 2.9 kg, 991 kg. So that's telling you how that whole nutrition is feeding back to the communities. And I was working with them, and I thought there are a lot of things going on in terms of transformation. We can look at one transformation. We can look at one mega indicator, and that indicator is what is happening to baby weight, birth weight. And if we can set like 3 kg, that will tell you entire background or story. So that's the way we are looking at this whole nutritional aspect. And they're also running their own community managed nutritional center for pregnant women. So that's very interesting. And the money they're getting from this empowerment program or social safety programs. And also there is a kind of credit sort of scheme. So if someone can't pay, they can pay later. So that's one aspect.
Thank you. So Robin, a few questions to you. Refugees versus internally displaced people. Any subsidies and lobbying for policy and regulatory change?
Yes, so thank you for the question. So yes, in the international arena, there's a distinction between refugees and internally displaced peoples. And the challenge is that in the media, the term climate refugees has been popularized. So you hear that term being used for people who are from Louisiana and were victims of the Hurricane Katrina, and you hear that the first climate refugees are in Shishmaref, Alaska. So there's this inappropriate use of the term in the media. But more importantly, one of the reasons why, in the context that I talk about relocations and why both of those scenarios don't fit, is because even the guiding principles on internal displacement are all about emergency movements of people. And in the best case scenario, this is not an emergency movement of people, because in the emergency movement of people, it's really hard to protect people's human rights. And in the emergency movement of people, you have humanitarian aid organizations providing for the basic needs of people. And what we need to be doing is recreating entirely for new places where people are going to be able to provide for themselves. So that's why in this case, it's a completely different scenario. And in regard to the government programs, and I'm most familiar with the United States because I'm a lawyer here in the United States, but I believe that this is replicated in other parts of the world. So in the US, we have the Stafford Act, and that is the federal legislation that guides the responses to disasters and extreme weather events. And in that legislation, repair and rebuild in place is the only thing you can do. That is, all the programs are geared for really repairing and rebuilding in place. And there is a voluntary buyout program where you can relocate, but it's relocating within the disaster area, preferably outside of a floodplain, for instance, but within the jurisdiction of the place where the disaster has occurred. And then on the policy level, so I am really happy to report that because of because of the phenomenal work of these Alaska Native communities who are climate warriors and the publicity of some of the research I've done, the Obama administration just issued a report on November 17th in looking at climate resilience and preparedness, and looking at climate displacement and relocation was one of the 35 recommendations out of 500. And I had meetings with the White House yesterday and say they are seriously looking at this issue, which is just, I'm thrilled that we're going to have national leaders looking at this issue and providing potentially an international model.
Great, thank you. So I think we've had a really rich discussion coming out of members of the Resilience Academy. I think you've heard us talk about livelihood resilience and climate change from a systemic point of view. We've talked about the dynamic aspect of resilience. We heard about power dynamics and climate warriors and tiger widows and how this all fits into thinking about resilience. We've also heard a lot about the dynamic processes that are involved in thinking about resilience programming. A lot of that in terms of thinking of champions and heroes and gurus, you were calling them, Vivek. We also heard a lot about the importance of indigenous knowledge and modern technology and bringing those issues together. And this is one of the core areas that we have been looking at in the Resilience Academy. Clive spoke about new, bold, and transformative approaches, like looking at population dynamics and family planning and reproductive health. And this is one of the tenets of resilience thinking. You're really looking at what's innovative, what's new, what's cutting edge, and putting that in place in a very dynamic way, and really thinking about what's practical and what's urgent, as we heard from Robin, and thinking about how that ties into framing around human rights and how that can provide a framework for both policy action but also for legal action. So I think we've had a really rich discussion today. Thank you very much to the panel. So this discussion has been recorded. The webcast will be available to you. The presentations will be available on our website, newsecuritybeat.org, as will be a summary of our discussion today. So please be sure to tune into New Security Beat to remember and go back to this discussion and a lot of associated materials. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
That was great. That was great. That came together really well. Yeah, and this will have a long shelf life. We'll continue pushing it out.
No, this
So,
was
yeah,
like, I'm like,
yeah.
wow, we need to market this.
Yes, we will. We will.